Hello class, I hope you're all doing well. I thought I'd do a front-facing video lecture today where I'm not just showing you my screen, but you can actually see me. So it's been a while. Hello, how are you? So your literature review is due this week, but the sort of next thing that's due is like the entirety of your paper, or the draft of it is next technically. So I thought it would be a good idea to go over the pieces of your paper that you will likely have or need. Now, obviously, what I'm going to talk about here is not entirely inclusive, right? I'm going to talk about sort of the bulk, like from your introduction to your conclusion, like those two things and everything in between that. Now, obviously, we are abiding by APA formatting this semester, so obviously you should still have like a title page and an abstract, and then after the body of your work, you should have your reference page with any, with entries for each source that you may have cited, referenced, or paraphrased throughout your work, and then also any appendix items. So that would be like any charts or graphs that you refer to in your paper but wanted to provide. If you did a survey, you will probably provide me with a copy of the questions that you asked. They don't have to be filled out surveys, but just a copy of the questions that were asked. Same with an interview. If you did observations, if you had some sort of observation log that you used, you might put a copy of the log itself, just like kind of the grid of it. Not necessarily filled out, right? Just to give me or your readers an idea of the process that you took to do your research. Okay, that could also include any sort of photos or pictures of things as well in the appendix items. But again, today we're going to focus primarily on the bulk of the written portion of your work, right? So anything from the introduction through your conclusion. So what I'm going to do is first tell you that sometimes the pieces of a paper that are present within a certain discipline is going to vary from discipline to discipline. So make sure that you familiarize yourself with papers from your discipline or your area of research or study to sort of get an idea of how those areas tend to put together their papers, what kind of parts they typically have, and how those parts are presented or utilized within the framework of the paper. There are some fairly standard sections, which again, I'm going to sort of talk about here. But again, depending on the discipline you're in or the area of study, those things might vary just a little bit. So the best practice in getting familiar with what your discipline uses or what the typical paper structures they have are probably to read journals and things like that publish papers from your area of study. Reading those, you'll start to get kind of an idea of the way that people in your discipline tend to structure their papers and present information. Okay, so the standard parts that we're going to talk about today are your introduction, the literature review, which of course you know a little bit about already, methods, results, discussion, and conclusion. Okay, so let's talk about each of them specifically and in particular, and talk about what the purpose of each of them are within the context of a paper that's being presented or written, right? So first of all, the introduction. Basically what it says, right? This is to introduce the idea of what your paper is about to your audience, right? You might talk a little bit about what inspired the research, what your research question is, any hypothesis you might have about what your conclusions or results might be. You could, house that in your introduction as well. You're also going to provide some necessary pieces of information that your audience might need to understand the paper. Now, this is going to be a little bit of an overlap with your literature review, right? A lot of that necessary background material that you're going to want to present to your audience actually is going to come in the form of your literature review. But if there are things that other people haven't talked about that you think are important to contextualize the research that you're doing, you might house those in your introduction potentially. Okay, so then let's go on to the literature review. So you just finished writing your literature review, so you should have a pretty good understanding of what this is and what this does. So this is a section where you will be sort of creating additional context for your work, right? Allowing your audience to know what has already been said about this topic and topics that might be related, and thus have some sort of consequence or whatever for your own work, right? The literature review is also a place where you can sort of put other sources in conversation with one another, right? So if you have 2 or 3 different sources that are all discussing in essence the same topic, but maybe they come to different conclusions or have different ideas about those things, you sort of contextualize or put together those ideas for your audience, you know? Whereas Smith and Johnson wrote about X and had basically the same ideas and conclusion, maybe Brown also talked about this, but came to a different conclusion, and sort of teasing out what you think or who you think maybe was the most right. You know, maybe Brown, although he came to a different conclusion, his work came way before Johnson and Smith, right? So that might, you know, create a context for why his results might have been different than Smith and Johnson, right? So here you're just sort of building a context for your audience of what has been said, what important things other scholars have already brought up, what we already know about the topic, etc. Okay, and sort of teasing out the most important pieces of information for your audience to understand and contextualize your own work. Okay. After you go through your literature review, the next thing, if you did primary research, the next thing that you're going to want to include in your paper is your methods or methodology. The methods section is really to provide your audience some information about how you did your research, what steps you took, what approaches you used, etc. Right? So if you have like a theoretical context that you're trying to fit everything in, you could talk about that in methods. If you did like a survey, you could talk about, you know, the kinds of questions you asked, you know, what you were trying to parse out of those survey questions, and, you know, the way that you went about distributing, for example, your survey, how you figured out who to send it to, how you sent it to them. If you did interviews, where did you interview them? What kinds of questions did you ask? Did you record the interviews? You know, a little bit further than that, you can also talk about the way that you utilize the information that you got from your primary research, right? So once you had your interview questions answered, once you had your survey questions answered, once you did your observation logs, what approach did you take to extract meaningful bits of information from that, right? Did you do sort of a qualitative analysis, a quantitative analysis, depending on what you asked for? Maybe you have information that you did both of those things. So this is a place where you're sort of explaining to your audience how you did your research in essence, right? And what steps you took, the approaches that you may have used in doing so. Next up are the results. When you're talking about your results, what you really want to get into here is, you know, the nitty gritty of it. You know, if you did a survey, what percentage of people responded X, Y, or Z? Here, when we talked about doing surveys and we talked about taking demographic data, right? So here you could even get down to those like nitty gritty things, right? So maybe you notice that certain populations answered questions in certain ways that differ from other people who answered in other ways, right? So maybe you find that people with higher household incomes answered your questions differently than those who had lower household incomes, for example, right? So you could sort of then play with that information. What do you think that means? Or what does that mean for your study, right? If you did observations, you know, what is it that you saw? And some of this might be more quantitative in nature, right? So how many times did you see X, Y, or Z thing? And some of it might be more qualitative in nature. How did people go about doing X, Y, or Z thing that you were trying to look for or at, right? But here you're going to basically just tell your audience what you found, in essence, okay? The next part of this is your discussion. Now, the discussion is sort of where you can take everything that you found and everything that you kind of already know based on your literature review, and maybe your hypotheses, and kind of bring these things together. Were you surprised by what you found? Was it as expected? How did this compare to some of the thoughts that other scholars have had who have talked about your topic in the past, or those periphery items in the past? And how, or what do you think, or what do you make of what you found? Okay. And then you're going to go on to your conclusion. Now, the conclusion is just sort of a summation. This is what I worked on. This is what I found, just sort of a short summary of those things. But also in your conclusion, another thing that you can do that's effective and something that's pretty common practice is explain why this work is important, but also what this work might mean for your field and what it might mean for the future work in your field. So if you did your study and it created a whole mess of other questions because of the data that you received, then those questions might be worth additional probing by future scholars, or maybe you. So the conclusion is basically, like I say, a place to sort of sum up, and then give some additional detail about how your work might affect the understanding of your field and the work that's being done in it and what could potentially be done in the future. Okay. So those are the pieces of your work, right? Introduction, literature review, methods, results, discussion, conclusion, okay? Again, as I said at the beginning of this, depending on the field you're going into, sometimes the pieces that are present might be a little bit different, right? So just keep that in mind, but these are fairly standard sections to most disciplines. So keep that, just keep that in mind. I hope you're all doing well. I hope you're staying safe and healthy, and all your loved ones are staying safe and healthy. If you have questions about things that are going on in class or whatever, just email me, or you can message me using the chat function in Microsoft 365 Teams. Just find me and message me, and I'll get back to you ASAP, okay? So stay well, and I will see you maybe in a video chat next week. I don't know. We'll see. We're just sort of winging it at this point because #quarantine life. All right. Have a good week, and I will chat with you, message you. See you soon. Bye.